Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from, coast to coast to coast today. Welcome to the Reflect, Reimagine, and Rebuild Stronger webinar. My name is Wayne Miranda. I will be your host and one of the speakers today. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the lands that we are present on. Where I work at Mcconnell Foundation, we are headquartered on the territory of the Mohawk people, a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst various nations. Where I'm joining you today from is Takaranto on Turtle Island. This is Dish with One Spoon territory, and it's the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. The Dish with One Spoon territory refers to an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee to share and protect the land, recognizing that we all eat with one spoon from one bowl, and that we have this shared responsibility, that the bowl is never empty, that there are no knives at the table, meaning that it's a shared responsibility to care for the land and the creatures within it. So now this home, of course, is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, which is true for all of us across Canada. Our roadmap for our session today is I'll just quickly go through some introductions and then set some of the context as to why Reflect and Reimagine are important steps before the rebuild. And then we're going to introduce some approaches to how to go about the reflection and reimagine as well. And then we'll get into some next steps. So for those who are less familiar with Mcconnell Foundation, it's an 80-year-old family foundation. It has major initiatives focused on building a more innovative, inclusive, and sustainable society in Canada. So we're a responsive grant maker, which means that we fund requests that come to us. However, we do focus on a number of core or a number of focused areas, so including Indigenous issues, social finance, sustainable cities, sustainable food systems, the transition to a net zero carbon economy, and the inclusive transition at that, youth mental health, and several other core issues that we work on. Our history and engagement with nonprofits across Canada, as well as the partnerships and the relationships that we have amongst social innovation practitioners, have led us to the dissemination and promotion of social innovation tools. And so we really have a strong focus on social innovation. And that manifests with a program called Innoweave, which is an initiative of the Mcconnell Foundation. Innoweave helps organizations and collaboratives innovate, and we have 11 or so different coaching streams where organizations can learn about and begin to adapt different social innovation approaches. So our presenters for today is, including myself, I'm the Social Finance Investment Readiness Lead with Innoweave. We will soon hear from Kimberly Nimrod, who's the former Vice President of the Canadian Red Cross and brings a tremendous amount of experience in disaster relief and crisis management. And then we'll spend most of our hour with Lynn Ferguson, who's a co-founding partner at Social Impact Advisors, as well as a long-time Innoweave coach. Also on the line, I'd just like to say Ryan Conway, who's the Program Director of Innoweave. He'll be on hand to answer questions as well, alongside Jacob Dicker, who's the Program Officer of Innoweave, as well as Anna Sophia, our super collaborator, Innoweave colleague. So thank you so much to my colleagues for joining today. So to begin, I will call on stage, if you will, Kimberly Nimrod.
Thanks very much, Wayne. I'd just like to first of all situate myself. I'm speaking to you from Coast Salish territory in Victoria, British Columbia, and I'm very pleased to be able to be part of this webinar. In the April Leading Through Crisis webinar, I introduced this simple schematic outlining the phases of a disaster. Keeping in mind that these curves will vary, take a moment now to place yourself and your organization along each. Is your response activity in red ramping down? Your green recovery curve making progress? Have you had a chance to look at the preparation work in blue for the predicted second wave? What I didn't include in this chart in April was another aspect, business continuity. The pandemic response was new, unplanned work. Business continuity, largely your core work for many organizations, the gray curve, was held back during the response, but may now be making a strong resurgence in your demands for your time and attention. Are you feeling those demands? Wherever you are along these curves, there is no right or wrong, but identifying where you are can help you understand what's happening for you, your organization, and your sector. Next slide. The need and urgency to move forward with rebuilding work may be patently clear to some people, and in some cases recognized as a necessity for survival. Others will see this as an opportunity to move ahead in new ways. And the recent outstanding global action in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion is creating a commitment to change that can drive new directions. At the same time, we must be aware of the real and valid forces holding us back. Your most vulnerable people, your most vulnerable clients and programs may still be deep in the crisis phase, exhausted and at risk. In some areas, we're not through the first wave of the pandemic and all know that we're facing a potential second wave this fall, with all that fear and uncertainty of what that means to people's health and the economy. It takes a massive amount of emotional, psychological, and physical energy to address emergencies like this pandemic. There's an excellent Harvard Business Review article called "If You Feel Like You're Regressing, You're Not Alone," that outlines a period where people feel a dip in energy between the adrenaline-charged emergency phase that many of us have just experienced and the true recovery phase where your team can be engaged in creating the future. The regressive phase is well known in developmental psychology. Acknowledging it can be part of supporting your team and yourself through it. Next slide. Given the different phases and forces acting on your organization, how can you apply the tools that you'll learn today? You could apply them to current vulnerabilities, ensuring that your organization addresses these priorities. This will give your people confidence that the management is aware of the current situation and the needs of their people. Has anybody around you been saying, "I just want the pandemic to be over. I'm sick of it"? It's a completely natural sentiment. And the pull to get back to normal, putting the pandemic behind us, is extremely strong. Don't be surprised if it's hard to focus people on the work to prepare for the potential of a second wave. We see this all the time with communities hit by forest fires and floods. They want to put it behind them, and only when they face the first outbreaks the next year do they realize that the preparation work they needed to do had been put aside in the desire and demands to move on. It's hard to keep some resources on the pandemic response improvements, but well worth the effort. People need to have concrete examples of their extensive learning during that first wave. They need to have confidence that the highest priority improvements to better manage a second wave are being acted upon. I say highest priority because there's a caveat to this. You'll need to manage expectations. It's really common in the heat of the moment to promise people massive improvements to a response system. "We're never doing this by paper again. It will all be computerized." Maybe something that you've heard. Only when the dust settles may it become apparent that digitizing a process is a much bigger project than anticipated. And you don't want to fall in the trap of preparing perfectly for the last disaster. You'll need to manage expectations or people can be very disillusioned on the lack of progress when the next disaster hits. None of this, though, should stop you from moving ahead with reimagining and rebuilding. Addressing current vulnerabilities and future risks can be part of your new direction. Consistent commitment to your organizational values can help, keeping your process lean and ruthlessly prioritizing so as not to overwhelm people. And do remember, you're not in this alone. Innoweave is here to help. The Leading Through Crisis mentors and Innoweave coaches continue to be available at no charge with no application process. You can reach out to the coaches and mentors directly through the website or by emailing Innoweave to be matched with someone who can assist you and your organization. Keep on keeping on, and don't hesitate to contact me if I can be of any support. Over to you, Wayne.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for setting this context. And just to continue along, so our goals, given this context so far, is really how can we prepare to rebuild? And our aims are twofold: to just introduce or perhaps just remind you of some helpful approaches to structure your thinking, to reflect on how your situation has changed and what implications and what opportunities are ahead of you, as well as to reimagine what a realistic organization will achieve and how. And the second aim for us today is just to gauge your interests and wants on next steps to progress your thinking and what would be most helpful in so doing that. So to begin, I just want to continue setting this context for our session by laying out why reflection and reimagining are important steps as you rebuild. Because we know that we do want to rebuild. We know that our organizations have been impacted in so many numerous ways, from canceling fundraising events we've heard, performance and exhibits being canceled, services being canceled, earned income streams and selling products or services have been hit hard. Frontline organizations seeing unprecedented demand for social services. Many of us are working remotely, shifting to digital services where possible. And some organizations that have been doing important work have had to hibernate or otherwise scale down. And so we know that we want to rebuild, and we hear this from organizations and in calls that I have almost daily with organizations, as well as we see this across the data across our country. And so while this slide is displaying data that happens to come from Saskatchewan, the data and the stories that we hear from Imagine Canada, from Ontario Nonprofit Network, from the Community Sector Council of Nova Scotia, from Manitoba Federation of Nonprofit Organizations, and so forth, all of this roughly tell a similar story of what we've experienced through COVID, that about half of our sector has remained open, but with significant modifications to our operations. Another quarter have closed or hibernated, and the remaining quarter are responding to just significant increased demand. And so we know that we do want to rebuild from this crisis, but not back to the old normal. And I see some comments in the chat box already referring to this. It's the old normal that in many ways led us to where these long-standing issues have come to the fore. The placard in this photo is really calling out to be part of the solution, not part of the pollution. Be that the pollution in our institutions and society, riddled with systemic and other forms of racism, or pollution in our bodies from inadequate food systems, or the pollution in our waters and air and lands, including our acknowledgement and our understanding of the history of the land. So many other old normals that have exacerbated this crisis that we do not wish to return to. And we see this as well. It's a moment of immense systemic change potential after so many of these social inequities, economic inequalities, and environmental crises have clearly surfaced. So now's the time, or it's an opportunity, I think, ahead of us, where we really want to embed the experience and lessons from the crisis to emerge increasingly resilient and impactful. And to share, I think, how we can do this, or how to begin, I'd like to now call upon Lynn Ferguson, who is the co-founding partner at Social Impact Advisors and a longstanding Innoweave coach, to help us through this. So Lynn, over to you.
Thanks so much, Wayne. Great to be here with everyone today and those who will hear it again later. Important topic that we're talking about today, and we want to get a sense, before we jump too far into reflect, about where folks are at on the impacts of COVID. So as we think about reflecting, we want to take a moment to have you actually real-time reflect and say, how has COVID-19 impacted your organization? So we want to give you a moment online now to respond to this poll, so we have a sense from today's participants about where you're at. Wayne certainly talked about a number of possible implications. There are others, and we'll we'll be fascinated to see where you are at this point in the implications for your organization. Just watch those numbers coming in. So certainly that third one down seems to be quite popular. And in this, you're answering more than one, so we might well get over 100% in total. So certainly that third one of having pivoted to provide different services or deliver or operate differently is affecting most organizations. We're seeing safety protocols, we're seeing closed operations or services, use of subsidies. Those seem to be our highest ranked responses there. It's just a reflect that says we've been through a lot. This has not been business as usual. This has not been normal, whether normal is good or not. And so we're going to reflect on these changes and more to think about where we're at now and where we want to be going as we move past reflect and start to reimagine for the future for those that are in a position to do that. So it looks like I guessed right, and that red one, the changing our operations, different services, different delivery is certainly our top one, but not the only one. Lots of changes happening there. Terrific. Okay, so as we keep moving forward here, we're going to think now about reflect and think about it from the standpoint, I got a little ahead of myself there. We're going to think about reflecting from two standpoints. One is from externally, what has changed or do we foresee changing as a result of COVID and other things happening right now? And then internally, what implications might this have? Has it already had? We've seen some of those in the poll that we just took a look at. So let's break those down. We're going to have a bit of a journey here. We're starting clearly with this reflect on our current situation, the current context. And we want to think both about what is it like now for our beneficiaries and customers? Have their needs changed as a result of the changing environment? And we'll also think about what we as an organization can bring to this, our typical look at kind of assets, strengths, and what opportunities or threats, constraints that might result in. From here, we're going to go to the end of the journey. We want to make sure that in thinking about our current context, we're then thinking about where we're trying to go. We don't immediately jump into the third step, which is what's the plan. So we don't want to go from what's our current situation, now let's act. We might have had to do some of that as we're working through this. But now, as time allows, depending where your organization is at on the curves that Kimberly was talking about earlier, this is a time to be able to look forward, to say, where is it that as an organization we are trying to be, we are aiming to achieve, and how best now might we go about doing that? That will bring us back to our plan in order to make it happen, to go from our current situation to the vision that we achieve, which might look the same or different than it has coming into the COVID situation. So we're going to think first about the needs of our beneficiaries, customers, clients, the people we are serving. How have the needs of those folks changed? We have a poll. It is perhaps because I'm a rookie at the poll, it's that we haven't shared these results back. I think I had a sneak peek and others could not see that. Am I right, Wayne? So that it would help to actually share that poll with everyone. I'm gonna.
I think we can proceed. I was just stopping the sharing so that we could see the slides.
Beautiful. Sorry, it pops up on my screen. Okay, so I'm gonna let you handle that and we'll carry on. My apologies. Okay, so we're thinking from the perspective of those who we are serving. What is going on with them? This is a time for us to get very close to our customers, our beneficiaries, the people that we serve. And so if you haven't been reaching out, this is a great time to be reaching out, be that phone calls, being that surveys, focus groups, whatever sort of fits your organization. It can also be getting directly from the frontline workers. What are they knowing about the folks that you are serving? If you're an Innoweave or Mcconnell grant recipient, you might well have had a phone call that was looking at how you were doing through this situation, which has led to the development of webinars like this and changes in reporting requirements, application processes, that kind of thing. So a very real example right there. We do have one tool to share around this, should it be helpful as you're thinking about those customers. And this is an empathy map. So if you're not familiar with an empathy map, it is about empathy, putting yourselves in the shoes of those beneficiaries, the people you aim to support. And so what is it like for those people through this current COVID situation? We can think about it from a number of different perspectives, as you're looking at here, to really understand what life is like to be these individuals. You can also look at this with organizations. So if you serve intermediaries, so as in the case of Innoweave or Mcconnell, they are serving organizations like yourselves. So it would be seeing what those organizations, what it's like for those organizations right now, so that we have a greater understanding beyond just the piece that we touch, how we interact with them, but on a broader scale, what kinds of things are going on for them, which might help us identify then, are there additional things we should or could be doing to help these people? So for example, in these times, lots of people would be having health concerns, right, about interacting with COVID, catching COVID. They'd be worried for themselves or family members. They might be feeling isolated or lonely with all the social distancing that we've been doing. They might have financial concerns depending on their situation. So a number of stressors that we might think about here. Childcare challenges and balancing that perhaps with working virtually, any of those things. And it's going to look different depending if your beneficiaries are low income people in your community. If you're working with philanthropists, you might find with them that there's challenges about they would like to give and support, but they're challenged with where best to give. How can we best help others at this time when there's such great demand across the board? Is it focused on COVID emergency relief, or should it be looking forward? And what are the right organizations to be supporting? So this is one tool to take a broad look at your different kinds of beneficiaries, and you can do multiples of these. So if you have different populations that you're serving, it's a snapshot, a profile of what a typical individual in that grouping might look like. This is all in the name of getting you and your team on the same page so that your staff, your leadership team, and your board all have the same kind of understanding about what is going on with your beneficiaries, your customers right now, and therefore what might we do differently to help. So for example, I'm working with a rural mental health group just outside of Ottawa. Many of those organizations in the collective identified that the youth were actually challenged with food insecurity early on in the COVID crisis. And many of them just spontaneously picked up addressing that need, finding ways to get food to these young people in a broader support of their youth mental health. Would not have been normally part of what they would do, but they recognized the need, the holistic view of what was happening with their client base, and were able to do something to support them in this time. So it's enabling that kind of thing to happen. Okay, so that's thinking from our beneficiary customer standpoint, so that again, you can all get on the same page with an understanding of what those needs might be. We also want to think from the organizational perspective, how has the context changed? The world in which we are all working has changed, is different. And again, we want to get your staff, your board, your stakeholders on the same page with what has changed and what might this mean for our organization. So we're pulling up again a typical framework. This one you may or may not be familiar with, used more often perhaps in the business environment than the nonprofit sector. It's a PESTLE framework, and it's just a way of applying different lenses to our context. So you can just straight up brainstorm, data gather about what kinds of changes have happened, what's going on in our world that particularly might have an impact for our organization. You might miss some things. You just might not think about things from a particular angle. Here's a way of thinking about it from 6 different angles to try to capture holistically what is going on in our environment. And so you can see there that we've relatively tried to adjust some sizes here. So the economic and social buckets, clearly big impacts with COVID. People being laid off, people concerned about their financial situation, affecting if we look from the economic bucket. You could also say there's more talk about basic income and the kind of supports economically that we have for people that is more out in the open now, and our essential workers, how some of them are in precarious jobs, low income situations, and how does that play out, which maybe spills over into our social also. Clearly from the social standpoint, we've got all the health risks and the social distancing and those components that we need to factor in to then be thinking about what will this mean for our organization and the services that we provide, many of whom have been providing services face-to-face. If I go back to the beginning, the political, this is what's going on from a government perspective. So depending on your organization, you might look at this at the municipal level. Maybe you're involved in needing approvals for building or construction projects that are delayed, or other things with your municipality. You might look at a provincial level, a national level. What is happening in those spaces? Certainly people are generally preoccupied with COVID, and rightfully so. It might mean that if your issue is not directly connected to COVID, it's hard to get the attention of what otherwise might have been allies in doing some work from the government sector. They are busy folks. So things to think about there. If I go back to technological, these are things about how virtual we are. So organizations that were already set up with a strong technology infrastructure are probably in a better position than those who have had to figure that out while working through this crisis. So it's looking at what are the changes technologically. Again, we're looking externally. So people are clearly more more reliant on virtual connections. They're needing to have internet and computer access. Your services might need to be offered in that way for people to be able to get at them these days. And so thinking about what has changed from that environment, it might be more important now than it was before that your organization have strong technical infrastructure. Legal, I've just put it small here. It's thinking about what are the legal implications, what has changed. Some of it might be it's really hard to get at lawyers, for example, if you needed approval for something because they're really busy with other COVID-related things. It can be things like privacy. So as we move to more virtual interactions, if you're offering counseling services now virtually, now you're in people's homes, you're seeing the background of where they're at. What does that mean from a privacy perspective? It might mean other people are able to hear the conversation from where they're calling in. How do you work through that? What approvals do you need? How do you make it safe for people and make sure you're within the law in what you're doing? How do you deal with young people? What approval do you need for dealing with younger folks? So just some examples there. And environmental, so particularly if you're an environmental organization, you're going to be thinking about climate change, the impacts of climate change. There's been some positive with COVID that, we're not out there driving so much, we're not manufacturing so much. So there's actually been at least a short-term benefit on climate change. How might you leverage that in the work that you do? We'll think about the implications of all of these things, but certainly climate change is still very real and yet overshadowed right now by COVID. And so what does all of that mean? So this again is a framework. It's a way of thinking about what is going on in the world right now. Let's just get that down, documented somewhere so we're all on the same page. Maybe some of us haven't been thinking about parts of these and yet others, maybe from our board, are more exposed to them from some other environment. And so let's get all of that information together and get our organization on the same page about the situation we're in so that then we can get on the same page about what we can do about it. So that's our framework for thinking through that. We then want to stop and reflect on all the great stuff we've been doing, all the assets and strengths that your organization brings to the table. We hope you're feeling like you've been supporting each other, you've been supporting your beneficiaries, you've obviously been making changes. We had, that was the highest ranking on the poll around pivoting, changing your services or your delivery. And so clearly there's some strengths there in flexibility, adaptability, problem solving, creativity, you name it. Chances are you've also been living your values. This is a chance to look back at those values and say, yes, those things that are core to our organization, those came through with shining colors. We were client-centered, we were empathetic, we were innovative in coming up with new solutions. Could also be it helps identify some other values that you've highlighted more that have come to the fore. That might be in what you have learned. You've been through a lot. What do you take away from this about your strengths, about opportunities, about, as Kimberly was saying, the need to not do this paperless next time, whether that's possible or not, some identification of the kinds of opportunities that have been identified as a result of going through this. So you certainly want to pause and celebrate and have renewed energy to carry forward with this work. And then most importantly, out of all of this is the so what. So if we roll it all together, given the needs of your beneficiaries and customers and how they may have changed through this and how you might expect they will change down the road, your own strengths and challenges and the current context and where you see it going from here, what opportunities does that present for our organization? And what challenges or constraints are there as a result of that? You know, how do we leverage the social movements, the advocacy interests that people have right now? That might be a kind of opportunity that your organization could leverage. And certainly challenges of fundraising and access to funds, stability are challenges and constraints that you want out there on the table to be thinking about, what do we do about this? So I want to share a little example before we wrap up Reflect here. And this is talking about Daily Bread Food Bank in Toronto, serves about 135 other food banks. So it's mostly distributing to other folks. As we all know, food insecurity has been an area of increased demand through this. So they've seen some 35% increase in the number of clients looking for support from the food banks. At the same time, in their context, folks, the staff, were nervous, particularly out of the gate. They did have some COVID cases to start with, and so people were nervous to come to work. They had a shortage of staff, particularly drivers, in delivering food. And if they can't get the food out, the people can't get the food. And they had at their focus what they'd always had, that they were going to ensure that Torontonians who needed it would get 3 days worth of food. And so they have continued to focus on that objective, find workarounds, find ways to deliver despite the challenges, despite the increased demand. And Neil Hetherington, the CEO there, and his team have done exactly that. So we've highlighted some of the actions that they've taken as a result. So checking out the context, the challenges that were there, increased demand and lack of volunteers and staff, and some of the centers that they would normally distribute food through had to close. Community centers forced to close as part of the rules around COVID. And so they partnered with others. They partnered with libraries and municipal workers to deliver food through pop-up food banks. They partnered with a moving company to distribute food when the drivers were concerned about COVID risks. They've been able to fundraise. So as an organization that of course is more known, Frontline, a clear connection with COVID, they're in a strong position to be able to fundraise and are getting good support. And they've just recently opened another warehouse to be able to distribute more food. They recognize that the film industry in Toronto is not at full capacity, and we're able to use some of that space, partnering with the Ontario government to be able to use that space to get more food out to folks. And at the same time, they had vulnerable populations who couldn't even come to the food banks, and partnered with Red Cross. Kimberly will like this. They partnered with the Red Cross to be able to deliver, I think it's about 1,000 deliveries out to individual homes for those folks who were more vulnerable, would be at risk of catching COVID, and so weren't able to come to food centers. So have made lots of things possible that previously were not possible. Neil might himself be on the line, and so is certainly free to keep me honest in the chat box if I've said anything out of school there, but I think there's great things going on. We're talking more about implications as we move forward, but these have been the short-term implications as a result of assessing the context and the strengths that this organization had, which clearly included the strength of their brand and the partnerships they were able to create. And so as a result have been able to serve this much greater demand, pivoted to do so, as many of you have pivoted. And we'll see down the road what that means for their longer term strategy. Now that they've set this higher bar of what they're able to deliver, where do they put the stake in the ground on that delivery and on the broader systems change that they might also be interested in achieving. So that wraps up our section on Reflect, on pausing to think about where we're at now before we think about where it is we'd like to go. So we have one more as we move into this. We have another poll. There's more to come. There might be more steps that you think of as your own steps to do. But we're going to launch a poll that says, what do you see perhaps as some useful next steps for your organization based on what we've been talking about?
Great, and the poll should be on your screen shortly. And just while we're waiting for the results to come in, Lynn, I'd like to just take a moment and recognize that there is a question in the chat box. And the question was in relation to the PESTLE tool.
Yeah.
Could spiritual and academic also be considered as lenses in that tool?
For sure. So, you know, there's no limit to what lenses might be really worth calling out separately from the ones that are there. I certainly think of equity as an important lens right now. So you could argue these are subsets of existing, like perhaps of social. In the case of equity, spiritual could also perhaps be under social, but they're all worth, you know, maybe health, it makes sense to call out separately from being within social because it's such an important component right now. So yes, make that a useful tool for you. It is sort of a starting point of some traditional ways of looking at things. Again, primarily in the business sector, still fully applies in the nonprofit world, but bring out other lenses that are important in this unique environment we're in to help your team get a clear understanding of where things are at. So great question. Thanks for that.
Perfect. Thanks. And maybe we'll just give another 10 seconds or so for the poll. And we'll have another chance to share feedback on what's going to be most helpful for you towards the end. We thought we'd just check in halfway to see how this is resonating or not. And I will close that and share the results. So it sounds like most of us are fairly comfortable. We've really recognized the context that we're in so far. And there's other supports that might be beneficial. So I will pass it back to you, Lynn.
Great. Thanks, Wayne. Okay, so we have covered reflection. You'll want to spend more time reflecting, but hopefully we've given you a little direction for your reflection. And we're going to move now into thinking about that end stage in our sort of 3-stage process, the end stage around reimagine. You'll hear throughout this the words clarify and align. That's what we're talking about again here. You want your team, your staff leadership, your staff, your board to all be clear about what is the impact we want our organization to have and how will we best achieve that. So we want that kind of clarity. We're going to look at this from 2 perspectives. One is around the objective itself, or what we call the intended impact, the difference you're going to make. You may have had this. So about half of you, based on the registration, have a theory of change. We're going to talk about a theory of change. If you have one, now is a time to revisit that intended impact. Is it still a worthy, realistic objective given the current context? So with that Daily Bread example, they've actually delivered, so same amount per person, but more people. And so there might be an argument that says maybe they should be setting a higher bar for what it is they're able to deliver coming out of this. Some others of you having to close, not being able to offer, you know, performances, live performances, or youth group gatherings. You know, maybe it changes the number of people you're able to support as we go forward. Or in fact, some people are finding that by providing virtual services, they're able to support a lot more people. And so you might have a switch the other way. Even though you've been closing services, you might then be looking for different ways to serve those people and find that your target is much higher. So we'll take a look at the intended impact and the objective of your organization, and then it's around, and how will you deliver it? What are the strategies? How best are you going to make it happen? And it may be that those strategies generally hold true, and it's more of the tactics within it that are changing. The ways you go about it, again, moving to virtual instead of in-person kinds of activities would line up with that kind of change. So let's dive into this. For those who have not seen, this is fairly foundational to Innoweave work in having a theory of change. And here's how we look at it. So first, it's the blue part. It's about our intended impact, the impact your organization intends to achieve and will hold itself accountable for achieving. This is the stake in the ground you're putting out there that you are going to figure out ways around in order to achieve it. And so we want to be very clear about the outcomes you'll hold yourselves accountable for what population, being as specific as we can. Perhaps it's a certain age group, it's within a certain geography, it's a certain socioeconomic status. You're going to be very clear about your priority groups that you are aiming to serve. And there's a time frame on it. It's by when. So many of you will have a vision and mission. This arguably falls under that. This would show a specific chunk you are progressing towards that mission, a specific objective that you are achieving that shows you're delivering on your mission. So it might be a 3-year, 5-year kind of time frame. It might align with your strategic planning. If you're an environmental organization, it might be a longer window, being that climate change does take time. Many of your processes take time. So that's the focus first, is getting the blue part clear, getting really clear about why is our organization here? What is it we're going to achieve in the next 3 years? Then we think about how you're going to make it happen, the strategies, the big picture activities you're taking on. And at this time, we might also then think about the operating model. How are you going to make that happen? And some of that may or may not have changed from a theory of change you might have had previously, if you had one. Otherwise, this might be a time to explore such a thing. So picture's worth 1,000 words. Let's share Youth Without Shelter, their theory of change. And I believe Steve Doherty might be online with us, the ED. And so again, certainly feel free to jump in if I mess up anything here. This group went through the impact and strategic clarity process with Innoweave, and then they went on to create their strategic plan, which is what this is looking at. Their impact statement might be a bit small for you to read, but it's the yellow text at the top of the roof. It says that from 2019 to 2024, 500 youth impacted by Youth Without Shelter will exit out of homelessness to stable living. And stable living is defined by lived voices, people with lived experience, as having income, a roof, a support network, and the opportunity to pursue interests or goals. This was a remarkable change from an organization that was an emergency shelter. They would previously focus on how many beds they're filling, how many people are able to be housed short-term at their shelter. And in doing this work, it includes doing some research, really getting grounded in data. Part of their really impactful research was surveying the young people who come into their shelter. And they discovered that there were a few different populations, sort of typical profiles of people, and were able to therefore customize their services to those folks. They also recognize there are a lot of people who are at shelters repeatedly. So they would have same people might show up at their shelter 3 or 4 times in a year, might in fact go to other shelters. And this was really discouraging to this group, that they wanted to be part of solving, part of getting these young people on a new path. And so put a bold, bold stake in the ground that says, we are committing to having these young people exit homelessness to stable living, and had the people involved define what stable living would look like. Really remarkable, inspiring change, exciting. The 500 number was a bigger number than the number of people they were serving before, although clearly serving in a much different way. And then they have their strategies. So sort of the 3 staircases here that says we're going to provide quality wraparound supports for youth who are at the shelter, which they were doing before, you know, supporting them with their mental health needs, education, finding jobs. And then the big aha was the middle one that says, if people are going to be stably housed, are not going to come back to our shelter, we need to make sure that as we help them find housing beyond the shelter, that we continue to support them, that they need those same supports of mental health and education and finding jobs. They need that hand-holding still to ensure that they can be stable. And so it was worth this organization investing in more of those external supports in order to make that happen. And then separately, their third one is around education, awareness, and advocacy. And they recognize the understanding that they had, particularly of folks, because they're near the Toronto airport. Refugees would come into the airport, and they are the closest source. And so they recognized that they really had insight on this population. And so there, for example, is a place that they should be a strong voice at the table, informing others about what the needs are, what the challenges are, any, you know, advocating that needs to happen, laws that need to be changed. And then below that is the mission support. How do we operationalize this? So this was really exciting for the group to do. I know their donors and supporters were really excited about it. It's energizing and motivating them and gave them this direction of what they're doing. And as Steve reports now, in going through COVID, this gave them clarity. So they still know that their objective is these 500 youth exiting homelessness into stable living. They know they're under constraints now. So as they look at their context, you know, they have space constraints that they cannot have as many people in their shelter. And so they were able to quickly get people housed using a portable housing benefit. They were able to get people, some 14 people housed in 9 weeks, which is a very quick process for what they were doing. Great work. They're now, of course, folks in the shelter are more spaced out and meeting the requirements there. They use this to help prioritize what is essential, what do they need to make sure of their activities absolutely carries on, and what can they scale back on if this is still the direction they're going. And obviously focusing on getting people housed was a top priority. They're also in the process of having another site in order, again, to be able to help more young people. And of course, with the context, government regulations, approvals, all of those things get put on hold for a bit. And with funding constraints, you know, some of that needs to just be on hold, but they know that it's there waiting for them when they have the go-ahead and the resources to be able to move forward with that in order to achieve this. So it's been a great support for this organization to have a theory of change, to provide them direction and be able to make decisions as the context changes. They have this to guide their work. I'm going to show one more example. I'm going to shout out kudos to YWS as we do that. And this is just, you know, we've talked a lot about direct service kind of organizations. This is Sierra Club in British Columbia. They also recently went through the impact and strategic clarity work and then went on to create their strategic plan. And this is more about the context of their organization. So Hannah Askew was the new executive director coming in, a lawyer who had worked with Indigenous communities, and she was brought in as a new executive director. So that's always a challenge as a new executive director. She was also given a new mandate, and the board mandate was that to this typically science-focused climate change organization, they needed to bring an Indigenous lens to their work. And so this was a challenge for the organization to question its values, its purpose, its alignment, again, with a new executive director coming in and bonding as a team. And in talking to Hannah recently, she talked about, yes, that was a difficult process. It made them, you know, it's a lot of navel gazing. It's a lot of putting on the table, honestly, how people are feeling. And not that there's a lot of butting of heads, but that people are coming at it from different perspectives. And the way things had been for 50 years was not the way things were going to be go forward. And yet you were working with the people who had been there for a long time. Anyway, Hannah says coming out of this that they feel so much stronger having gone through that process to now be faced with the COVID challenges. They are turning to this, they're knowing that they have shared values. They know that they're all clear about the direction that they're headed, the work they're doing in having both the science and the Indigenous lens together. And you can see that you might not be able to see, we've had to take their lovely tree, which is one, and cut it in half. But on the right there, you can see that their goals are within the context of respecting Indigenous jurisdiction. We will, 1, support and enable leadership for climate action and resilience, and 2, protect ecosystems and nurture their abundance. My eyesight is failing. And then they've got advocate, educate, and organize as key strategies that they would support around that. So they went through a lot in building this, and it has been very beneficial to them as a solid organization now, all being clear and aligned about the work that they're doing. It certainly doesn't hurt that clarity and alignment they used just before COVID in order to get a large donation. So they actually got a $2 million donation, which is more than their operating budget. And so coming into COVID with that comfort, many of you organizations I know struggle financially with the uncertainty. They are in the place of having some financial security by which to move forward, some of which certainly can be attributed to this, that the clarity by which the individual was able to share the story of what this organization is about to garner that support has really good sign for their theory of change. So We can't promise that that's, that there's a big check awaiting all of you in having a theory of change, but we would encourage that there is value in getting the team aligned, very clear about what is it we're here for? Why are we here? What are we willing to hold ourselves accountable for in the next few years? A measurable, tangible result, and get clear about how we're going to take that on. Again, for your staff, for your board, have that alignment. It's powerful with stakeholders for them to then be able to buy in, and other supporters, right? Advocates. Today, now is a time to be able to bring on more advocates, perhaps, in this environment to support your cause. So creating a theory of change might be something to think about at this time, or otherwise gaining that kind of clarity for your organization. So I'm just going to talk to a couple more things here. We have spoken more or less to the first three. In thinking about the context around us, it might question our assumptions about what the world is like and what our role in it is. We might revisit our vision, mission, values, or you might just find them reinforced by the great work that you're doing. Either way, good to have that confirmation that that's what you're all about. And then your theory of change might highlight your strategies, goals, and tactics. What happens next in the blue is really a more operational, more around, and how are we going to make this happen? So if you've still got a lofty, great, ambitious goal to really make a difference in your community, yay, and let's figure out what you need to do to make that happen. It might be, as we saw with the Daily Bread, that there's more opportunity for partnerships, that it's not just the skills that you bring to it, but how can you work with others in order to serve different clients, more broader clients, or bring other services, make it work in different ways? Could be with government who cares about the same end result you care about. Perhaps there's a partnering opportunity there. We're also hearing more talk within organizations about, is there a way for similar organizations to work together to share more of the operational costs and processes to then be able to better serve more folks? Many of you, as I mentioned, are also challenged in your revenue situation, fundraising challenged, not having your galas, not having commitments from other funders. So this can also be a time to think about your revenue model, and are there other ways to be generating the revenue that you otherwise might have? So this could be things like social finance opportunities, like a community bond. Could you do a community bond raising activity? Is there a social enterprise opportunity, a kind of business model? And maybe it's online these days in order to make that happen. Is it fundraising virtually, something you haven't been involved with before? So certainly worth exploring what those different revenue models might be. You might also look within your organization. So perhaps you've identified some different activities that needed to happen that might have implications for your structure or your team in terms of a skill set that would be great to bring on around government relations or around emergency preparedness or operational pieces. And then what is happening with your culture, particularly if your organization is moving virtually? Are there ways to enhance and bring to the fore the values that your organization has and make sure that those hold true despite the changing environment to maintain your culture? And then there will be a trickle down about processes that are changed and systems, technological infrastructure that are in place. And so all of those are thinking more deeply around operationally now. Once we're clear on that big objective we have and the high level strategies to achieve it, what do we need to do differently now, given the challenges of our context, in order to make that happen? So that is our session on reimagining, about thinking about what the future holds and getting everyone aligned on what that can look like to be able to move forward and eventually think about rebuilding. Wayne, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
I'm just seeing some problems with my internet connection, so hopefully this is working. Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm just going to briefly touch on some potential next steps now. So things that are available to you right now, today, as we speak, are on the left-hand side. So continuing to offer crisis mentorship. This is Kimberly Nimrod and her very experienced network and team of crisis mentors. We're continuing to offer micro-coaching through the Innoweave platform on any number of different Innoweave streams. as well as the existing Innoweave work of providing coaching on any of those streams is also available. And what we're really looking for from many of you today is feedback on what could potentially be some next steps. We're thinking about evolving this particular stream of support. Lynn has pointed to some approaches, some structured ways of thinking, and we're trying to assess your interests and your wants of what could be offered next. Could it be workshops with your team to really help you schedule that time for externally facilitated practical exercises to reflect, to reimagine, to kind of grapple with the prompting questions that we're leaving you today? It could be an hour of your team time. It could be, half-day sort of cohort-based workshop. The format can be flexible and flex to your needs. Similarly, this second bullet point on your right-hand side there would be potentially similar sessions or workshops, but on more specialized topics, perhaps. So could it be financial planning, looking at the scenarios, the forecast of your finances to perhaps scale down some elements of programs that you might not want to continue, or potentially acquire new programs. So from those that are scaling down, potentially some of those programs might actually be more beneficial to another partner or to another organization who could then acquire them on your behalf. Maybe it's adapting a different model and you need to understand the financial implications of adapting that model, or maybe you need to scale up new elements, new programs. And so a session similar to this or a workshop similar could be on any number of those elements. Potentially a specialized session on human resource planning in response to this, or operations adaptation, so adapting activities, processes, systems to online. And so I just want to run another poll to just gauge your interest and on what you see as potential next steps or most beneficial next steps for you. So that poll should be showing up on your screens, and if not, it will shortly. Sometimes it takes a few seconds.
Hey Wayne, it's Lynn. I was noticing lots of some commentary about workshops in the chat box. So now is a chance for people to show that in the poll.
Great, great. Thanks, Lynn. And we are nearing the top of the hour. And so just as we continue that poll, I'll just bring up our last slide here, which is just a thank you. A thank you to Lynn Ferguson for taking us through some of these examples, the really helpful structured ways of thinking and the tools that you've offered. Thank you to Lynn. Thank you to Kimberly Nimrod for holding a lot with crisis mentorship and management, and a lot of those supports are still available today. And to my Innoweave colleagues for supporting in the background. So we will stay on for the next 30 minutes at least. So if anyone has questions, now is your time. So what I would suggest is if you can put up your hand, just so that we can take questions one at a time, that would aid us in the facilitation of the Q&A. So thank you all for joining. If you do have to get to your next thing, we completely understand. We will send out the slides as well as the recording of the session, and you're always welcome to follow up via email. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend.